Hi everyone, how are you doing? Good? That's good. Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge the presence of any First Peoples that might be with us this evening. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you to everyone here at the Prov. This is a very, very important institution for historians. It's a very, I'll speak a lot about it tonight, but it feels very special being here. When Sherpa Chanelmish first reached out to me last year with the idea of having an event highlighting Victorian women whose histories had been overlooked from our history, it was an immediate yes from me. And seeing the turnout tonight, it's clear that many of you share the curiosity and commitment of talking about history. And it's especially fitting that we're here at the Public Record Office Victoria at a moment of significance, as Natasha mentioned, and I've been told that every year on the 1st of January, hundreds of archival records are released to the public as part of Prov's annual Section 9 openings. These records, which contain personal information such as capital case files, criminal trial briefs, and divorce records, are temporarily closed to protect privacy before eventually being made accessible. But this year marks something new. For the first time, Victorian Cabinet records closed under Section 10(1) of the Act are also being opened to the public. Now, I think I have a slideshow. Is that it? Okay. Being open to the public. These are records that reveal the internal deliberations and decisions of the state government, documents that show not just what was decided, but how and why. This first release covers the years 1982 to 1992, a pivotal decade in Victoria's political history. And within those records is the premiership of Joan Kirner, Victoria's first female premier. That connection between the records held here, the stories they contain, and the people we're here to remember is exactly why archives matter. So when we think about history, we often imagine something fixed. Facts written down, preserved, and agreed upon. But history is shaped by what was recorded, what was kept, and just as importantly, what was left out. Archives are the raw materials of that process: letters, reports, photographs, cabinet minutes, and they determine the stories we're able to tell. If something isn't preserved, it becomes harder to remember, to study, or to even acknowledge. In that sense, archives don't just store history, they actively shape it. But places like this can sometimes feel distant or intimidating. Quiet rooms, shelves of records, microfilm machines, I still don't quite have the hang of them. But they are, in fact, living public institutions. They belong to all of us. And the question is, how do we get people to care about them? These records are not just about the past, they're about accountability, transparency, and identity. And they show us how decisions were made, who held power, who didn't, and how those dynamics continue to shape our lives today. And they give us the tools to challenge the record by filling in the gaps, recovering missing voices, and telling more inclusive stories. Because if we don't engage with archives, the risk isn't just that history is forgotten, it's that it remains incomplete. But if we do engage, if we open these records, question them, and share them, then archives become something powerful. Not just a record of what was, but a resource of what could be, a way to ensure more voices are heard and remembered. But archives have never been neutral. That is a self-portrait of me this morning. It's actually a very wonderful painting by Annie Lee of an exhausted woman. I think a lot of women in this room can relate to that experience. As Simone de Beauvoir wrote in The Second Sex, representation of the world, like the world itself, is the work of men. They describe it from their own point of view, which they confuse with absolute truth. Historical records often reflect the perspectives and priorities of those who created them. most often men in positions of power. As a result, women's achievements have frequently been overlooked, undervalued, or attributed to others. And yet women have always been part of history, leading, organising, resisting, creating, caring. We know women were always there. History itself makes that undeniable. But their presence was not always recorded or recognised. Their contributions were often considered private, informal, and therefore less likely to be preserved. Which is why it matters not only to preserve archives, but to question them, to ask whose voices are here and whose voices are missing. And it feels fitting to begin with Joan Kirner, not only because of her historic role, but because her story now lives in new ways within the very records being opened here. She became Victoria's first female premier in 1990, yet at the time her leadership was sometimes framed as an extension of her predecessor, as if she were not premier in her own right. Had she not been a woman, her time in office might have been treated as a brief interlude. That would have done her legacy a great disservice. She represented a series of firsts: the state's first female premier, the first Labor premier from the socialist left, and the first with a strong background in community politics. She challenged a male-dominated political culture to recognise that community leadership through roles as mothers, advocates, and local organisers was a legitimate pathway into political life. Her story, like so many others, reminds us why archives matter. They preserve the evidence that allows us to recognise women's leadership, contributions, and struggles, and ensure those stories are not lost or overshadowed. And that is exactly what tonight is about: bringing those stories to light and recognising the role that archives play in preserving lives, both celebrated and quiet, that together shape our understanding of the past. And it is worth acknowledging that alongside remarkable figures, the archives also hold the traces of many others, women whose lives were quieter, but no less meaningful and equally deserving of remembrance. And that brings me to our speakers tonight. Formidable women in their own right. Each historian will share a story of a woman from Victoria's past who deserves to be better known. Our first speaker is Scarlette Nhi Do, who is a screen scholar based here in Melbourne and the latest recipient of the RMIT Australian Screen Research Collection Fellowship. Her work explores how cinema, memory, and politics shape national identity, informed by her own experience as a Vietnamese migrant. Tonight, she will speak about Lady Gladys Nicholls, highlighting not only her vital role in Aboriginal civil rights and community organising, but also the often overlooked significance of her Indian Australian heritage and what it reveals about the entanglements of colonialism, migration, and solidarity. Next, we'll hear from my former research supervisor at Melbourne, Zoë Laidlaw, who's a professor of history at the University of Melbourne. Zoe's work focuses on British colonialism and its legacies, including the intersections of wealth, philanthropy, and power. She will discuss Janet Biddlecombe, a prominent pastoralist and philanthropist whose success was deeply tied to colonial expansion and dispossession. Her talk invites us to consider how wealth was made and used in colonial Victoria and how philanthropy helped shape enduring narratives about society and history. And finally, Kacey Sinclair, who's a PhD candidate at La Trobe University. Her talk is going to focus on Fanny Finch, a Black British woman who lived in central Victoria between 1850 and 1930. Kacey will explore how she uncovers evidence of racism and intersectionality within archival records that were often designed to obscure the lived realities of people of colour during the colonial and early Federation periods. Her work shows how we can read against the grain of the archive to recover voices that were never meant to be preserved. Together, these speakers will bring to life stories that challenge what we think we know about the past and demonstrate the power of archives, not just to preserve history, but to transform it. Thank you, and you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions at the end, but if you could join me in welcoming Scarlette to the stage.
Begin with my slide. All right, my name is Scarlette. Good evening to you all. And I want to quickly note before I begin that the presentation will include mentions and likeness of Aboriginal elders who have passed, so audience discretion is advised. I want to begin the presentation from an unlikely time and place. When I started working as a She Shaped History tour guide in August 2025, the March for Australia also took place. The usual pundits would gather around Parliament Gardens at the start of the marches, which makes the gardens a somewhat scary stop on the tour. My initial nervousness turned into amusement when I reflected on the experience and realized the irony. As these individuals prepared to march, to take up space, to reclaim this country from First Peoples and immigrants, they stood meters away from the statues of Sir Douglas and Lady Gladys Nicholls, whose lives and Aboriginal communities were impoverished to build the very nation that apparently doesn't belong to white people anymore. So as the proximity between me, a Vietnamese migrant, white Australians and Aboriginal activists in Parliament Gardens already foreground, this talk is about who gets to take up space figuratively and literally, who is allowed access to the Empire's gardens, who gets to own land, and how can we acknowledge that ownership. Lady Gladys Nicholls' history and achievements allow us insights into these questions, and here's a photo of the statue. Yes. Gladys Nabi Muriel Bucks was born in 1906 in Kamaraganja Station, an Aboriginal reserve on Yorta Yorta country, which is just on the New South Wales side of the Murray River. Her mother, Alice Campbell, was a Jajawarong Parapa woman, and her father, Mir Baksh, a Punjabi Indian, ran a grocery store on the Victorian side of the Murray River. Oh, where am I? There we go. And he ran the grocery store in a township called Barma. In 1939, Gladys joined 200 other Kamaraganja residents in a historic walk-off to protest their poor living conditions. After settling for a short time in Barma, Gladys continued walking into Melbourne in search of work and collective organising, and she found it in the suburbs of Fitzroy and Northcote, where many First Nations communities resided, and the grassroots movements for Aboriginal civil rights was gaining momentum as well. Oh, yes. Yeah. After her first husband, Herbert Nicholls, died from a car accident injuries in 1942, Gladys married his younger brother, Douglas. Douglas's devotion to Gladys was a clear example of what the kids nowadays would call hashtag, if he wants to, he would. He was a very accomplished and busy man. He played professional football. He was a pastor and a leader in the Australian Aborigines League. But his efforts did not rival the work that Gladys did behind the scenes, nor did it undermine what she brought to the movement. This was acknowledged by many in their community as people joked. Sir Douglas brought home the work, but Lady Gladys did all the work. Yeah. Besides her work, as a wife and a mother, she looked after their 6 children. Lady Gladys also cared for her community and fundraised the much-needed money for the Australian Aborigines League, and later the Victorian Aborigines Advancement League that Sir Douglas co-founded in the mid-1950s. Lady Gladys opened one of the first opportunity shops here in Victoria, organized bake sales and debutante balls, and hosted young Aboriginal people in her home. The youth hostel she opened in 1958, located on 56 Cunningham Street, Northcote, continues running today, offering Indigenous youth somewhere to go when they have no options left. Lady Gladys also founded the Women's Auxiliary within the League, which provided the community with many resources. They helped children stay in school by giving them books, shoes, and uniform. They also accompanied people through the criminal justice system by attending court appointments with these individuals and giving them social and legal resources. Historian Patricia Grimshaw notes, Gladys Nicholls was at the forefront of grassroots workers who sustained networks to develop resources and facilities that were crucial for their material support and community lives. The material and emotional support Gladys gave to her community established important foundations for the League's operations and enabled it to become a forerunner in its advocacy. One of the important campaigns that we have records of here in the archive is the campaign for the reclamation of rights over the Bama Forest and Kamaraganja Reserve in 1975. Let's look at this letter to the Minister of Conservation from the League's acting director in 1975, Elizabeth Morgan Hoffman. Please find enclosed a submission from the Victorian Aborigines Advancement League in regard to the Bama Forest and Kamaraganja, New South Wales Aboriginal Reserve, on which many of our people were born, and so this area is very important to us because of our culture and heritage. Dated April 4th, 1975. At the top left-hand corner, we have the address of 56 Cunningham Street, Northcote, the League's headquarters, and looking beneath the address, we have the names of two life members, Sir Douglas Nicholls and Margaret Tucker. There was, of course, resistance against this campaign from the state government, and we have it here in the correspondence within the leadership of Victorian Forest Commissions. The district forester, R.L. Paul, wrote, quote, I recommend that any attempts by the Aboriginals to take over Bama Forest be strenuously opposed. The campaign was ultimately unsuccessful. Australian settler governance refusing Indigenous people repossession of the land on which their ancestors had lived for thousands of years is nothing new. Land governance is, in fact, the very mechanism by which Australia, a settler colony, maintains its control over the lives of non-white populations. This means control over who gets to grow food, who gets to grow resources like trees and animals, and who can benefit from these resources. And we don't have to look further than Lady Gladys's family and the records contained within the Public Record Office, Victoria, to see evidence of this. Between 1927 and 1934, Lady Gladys's father, and here's a picture of him, under the anglicised name Mira Navy Bucks, wrote to the Secretary of Lands 14 times, begging for land, and I didn't use that word lightly. The first letter in the records dated November 1927 says, Sirs, I have had 1 acre of ground that you granted to me before, but it is still a bit too small. But now I am asking you if you would oblige me by granting me 3 acres for myself, 3 for wife, and 3 for son. My wife is this country native, and I am a British subject. Mira Bucks asked for a total of, I very elegantly handled that. He asked for a total of 9 acres to be shared between his family of 5, minus Gladys, who recently got married, so it's roughly the size of 7 soccer fields. His requests were, surprise, surprise, unsuccessful. We have here the decision from the Secretary for Lands, dated March 21, 1932. I have to inform you that in view of a departmental report just received, it has been decided that no further licenses for land in this locality will be issued. Your application must therefore be declined. And we have a record of the report itself, dated March 2. The Navy Bucks family are Indian hawkers and not gardeners. And while Mira and Bucks obtained the Crown grants and lived on them and still reside there, the areas were and are only used as horse paddocks. Abraham N. Bucks is a son of Mira, and I understand that he has just completed serving a sentence of 6 months for sheep stealing. That last sentence was underlined in red and emphasized with 2 red vertical marks on the margins. The report continues. The family has no standing or respect in the district and are not desirable tenants for the department. On the other hand, they are apparently prosperous, and there is no difficulty in obtaining payment from them for land or any purchase they make. Mira responded to the secretary's decision in the same month, March 30th. Dear sirs, I am a British subject, and you must pay addendum to my letter. I want ground for my wife and 3 children. I haven't done anything to anyone, and why should you refuse for the ground? I have 1 acre, 1/4 is a garden with 15 fruit trees. 1/4 is a house. I have 2 boys and 1 girl and my wife and myself. Now, what could we do with the other little bit of ground that is left? It is not enough to rear fowls. I have horses and sows and sheep. Now, please tell me where I am going to put them. Here, Mira, despite not knowing how to read or write and having to use an intermediary, tried to capitalize on his status as a British subject to give his Aboriginal wife and their 3 children lands outside of Kamaraganja station to farm and make their livelihoods. It's important to remember that these exchanges took place after the introduction of the Aborigines Protection Act in New South Wales in 1909 and its amendments in 1915. So we have to view Mira's desperation in a context of increasing destitution in the station. But Mira's savviness is no match for the colonial apparatus bent on dispossessing Indigenous people within the British Empire past and present, no matter where they end up. And his own lived experience as a labourer from British colonized India attests to this. We might look at the report's emphasis on his son Abraham's theft of a sheep as the key explanation for the Lands Department's decision to not license the family. Here, manufactured destitution through laws like the Aborigines Protection Act necessitates petty crimes that are themselves defined and punished by the legal systems all too willing to assert white domination. And the overrepresentation of Indigenous youths in our prison systems today suggests that not much has changed. We might look at the inconsistencies between the reports and Mira's letters as further evidence that officials could not make sense of the Bucks' resourcefulness in spite of the regime. While the officials claim that the Bucks were hawkers, that means they travel to sell goods, and not gardeners, Mira's letter indicates a garden well cared for and abundant of fruits and animals, but their capability in the end does not mean much to these officials. What matters is their race and their status as colonized subjects. That Mira Bucks died at sea in 1938. This photo is the last record we have of him. Further suggests Gladys's decision to walk off in 1939 and become involved in the Aboriginal civil rights movement as a fight for her people's survival. This vignette of her family struggle for land licenses elucidates, on an individual level, the inner strength that she must carry to keep on organizing. It also explains her resourcefulness. That is her ability to produce abundance from nothing, as her parents and siblings grew fruits and animals on the 1 acre of land that they shared. Back in Parliament Gardens, I see the same logic at play. I see protesters forgetting whom Australian structures and systems have historically served. I see them bristling at the abundance First Peoples and people of colour and immigrants have created for themselves despite systems that give them very little, that take this little away as well. But as Lady Gladys Nicholls' statue stands proudly in a garden that has otherwise been refused of her family and community, I take comfort in the knowledge that history is being rewritten, that new stories about Australia will come forth to highlight Asians and First Nations shared struggles under settler colonial regimes. Stories that, at the very least, help me feel closer to Lady Gladys, as we are both daughters of immigrants, and help me feel braver on the tour. And so I want to end with these words. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet here today, who continue to stand strong despite settlers' efforts to diminish them. They are the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people of the Kulin nations. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. This garden, this farm, this land was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's going to be a hard act to follow. And especially it's hard to follow that beautiful acknowledgement of country. But I too would like to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung lands this evening, lands that have never been ceded, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like also to note that I'll be speaking a lot about the lands of the Wadawurrung people, and so I acknowledge them and their elders past and present, and their unceded lands as well. So I'm going to speak about Janet Biddlecombe, a woman who had enormous wealth and privilege and considerable power, especially compared to the others that we're hearing about this evening. Janet was a pastoralist, she was a world-leading breeder of Hereford stud cattle, and she was a very generous philanthropist. When she died in 1954, she was 87 years old. But as I'm going to explain, Janet's been remembered in misleading, if interesting, ways. Her achievements, on the one hand, have been diminished or distorted by gendered framings, but by contrast, Janet's efforts to insert her own family's story into Victoria's history were so successful that we very seldom scrutinise them. So I'm going to outline a bit about how Janet came to be rich and powerful, talk about what she did on her own account, and think a little about how she sought to shape understandings of Victoria's history. And I'll finish off with a few words about what we might make of that in 2026. So this first slide shows you Janet Russell, or as she was, who became Janet Biddlecombe. And here are her parents, Euphemia Carstairs and George Russell. All three of these portraits are in the collection of the State Library of Victoria, and Euphemia and George are actually on public display. So immediately we can see that these are people regarded as important to Victoria's history, at least by the trustees of the State Library. And George Russell and Janet Biddlecombe also have their own entries in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, another marker of significance to our understanding of our own history. In fact, George Russell was one of the earliest colonisers to arrive in the Port Phillip district. He crossed over Bass Strait from Tasmania in the mid-1830s as part of that brutal and rapid colonial invasion of Western Victoria in particular. And we know that George Russell directly participated in the violent seizure of land from its traditional owners, and in his case, particularly from the Wadawurrung people. George Russell had emigrated in 1831 to Tasmania. He came from Scotland, and when he landed in Port Phillip in 1836 with several thousand sheep, he did so as the manager of an entity called the Clyde Company. And this company's aim was to grow wool in Victoria on its rich lands that were expected to be rich for pastoralism, and for that wool to be exported back to Britain. Most of the Clyde Company's partners were rich Scottish merchants. They'd invested heavily, all of them pretty much, in chattel slavery in the United States and the Caribbean, so their wealth came from owning enslaved people and trading in the sugar and the cotton that those enslaved people produced. But when slavery faltered in the 1830s, the British made it illegal in their colonies, some such merchants diversified to places like China, India and Australia. And over 2 decades, George Russell and the Clyde Company that he represented would come to control over 230,000 acres of prime pastoral land across Western Victoria, not talking about 1 or 9 acres, we're talking about 230,000 acres, shown there in blue and a little bit faintly in yellow. Through the Clyde Company and his wealthy backers, George Russell controlled a lot more money than most of his pastoralist peers. The partners' original £15,000 investment in the company and their provision of lines of credit made a really major contribution to George Russell's and the company's success, and that success was very significant. The Clyde Company only operated for about 21 years, but when its assets were dissolved in the late 1850s, it was valued at over £250,000. In 1841, George Russell had become a partner himself in the Clyde Company, as well as its manager here in Victoria, so he profited very directly from this success. And that meant that when the company was dissolved in 1858, Russell was able to buy the Clyde Company's main station, which was called Gulf Hill. It still sits in Shelford, about 40 kilometres west of Geelong. When he died 30 years later in 1888, Russell's personal estate was valued at over £360,000. These figures seem large, they're a bit unclear perhaps to us today, but that amount in 1888 is equivalent to somewhere between $50 and $200 million today. In 1851, if we go back a bit, Russell had visited Scotland, and there he married his first cousin, Euphemia Carstairs. Back at Gulf Hill, the couple had 8 children over the next 15 years, 7 girls and 1 boy. Janet, born in 1866, was the youngest of them, and when she was just 1, her mother died. Janet, who we can see in this photo aged 10 or 11, she's second from the left in the back with quite severely tied back hair, the small child. She grew up in this very large and very wealthy family. The Bluestone Mansion at Gulf Hill was built, I think, probably just after this photo was taken, and it was fitted out with weighty furniture and to European tastes. As was typical, when George died in 1888, his will prioritised his only son, but it did make generous provision through trusts and things for his daughters. Janet, however, while still in her 20s and unmarried, arranged to pay out her brother Philip and take over the management of Gulf Hill herself. And she would continue as the manager of Gulf Hill right through to her death in 1954. In 1900, she married this man, John Biddlecombe, an English naval officer who, after their marriage, retired to Gulf Hill and assisted her in its management. John, who was by all reports a heavy smoker, became an invalid by the mid-20s, and he died in 1929. The couple had no children of their own. In the early 20th century, Janet and John had begun a cattle stud. By the 1930s, Gulf Hill was renowned not just for its wool, which was the consequence of George Russell's work, but as a Hereford stud as well. And in the 1940s, it was recognised as preeminent in Australia and possibly the world. Its cattle sold for regularly record-breaking prices, and in several years, its Hereford bulls and cows collected all the prizes in their classes at Melbourne and Sydney's royal shows. Janet's pastoral success did receive significant media coverage. Her success was considered remarkable, partly on its own terms, but also because she was a woman operating within a male-dominated sphere. So there are regular features about her in the women's pages of different newspapers, but she also featured in the paper's business and pastoral sections. Those latter reports, when we read them, however, we see that they emphasise the different men who worked for her and were assumed to be responsible for the stud's great success. Overall, I think the press coverage, and it's extensive, of Janet's life and her work in pastoralism suggests that it was really difficult in the 1920s, 30s, 40s and even 50s to conceive of a female pastoralist's success as truly her own. By contrast, John Biddlecombe, who died well before Gulf Hill's Hereford stud achieved its greatest success, was often credited with laying its foundations. Actually, I think there's very little hard evidence that he did more or perhaps even as much as Janet. His background was in the Navy, he enjoyed sailing his yacht on Corio Bay, he was a gentleman pastoralist and later an invalid. So Janet's business success has been remembered in gendered terms, and her legacy as a philanthropist, which I'll talk about now, is just as complex. The first thing to note here is again that the Biddlecombe's philanthropy was received at the time and has been remembered in gendered ways, whether we're talking about contemporaries, beneficiaries or historians. The facts are, however, that most of the wealth the Biddlecombe's gave away was derived from Janet's fortune, and that she gave away many times what her husband did. Philanthropic motivations, of course, are very complex and difficult to unpick. They're seldom solely altruistic. Philanthropy can be used, of course, to perpetuate a donor's own name or that of their family. Which causes philanthropists choose to support, what conditions they put on bequests, these can give a real political or religious charge to their donations. So to give away money, especially large sums, as Janet Biddlecombe did, is to exercise power. How did this work with the Biddlecombes? They generously supported Australia's 1914 to 18 war effort, and the press identified their donations as among the largest from private individuals. And Janet would donate in similar ways during the Second World War. The couple also gave money to their local community in Shelford and to a series of medical charities. Their 1926 donation, for example, equipped the Geelong Hospital with its first X-ray suite. And I do imagine that John Biddlecombe, in his failing health, the heavy smoker, probably made early use of it, so it may not have been as altruistic as it sounds, that one. But in October 1953, a few months before she died, Janet sold her Hereford stud, raising over £125,000. All of that money, as well as the vast majority of the over £550,000 she would leave in her estate the following year, went to causes that we would deem benevolent, if sometimes a bit paternalistic. In particular, she favoured the Red Cross, the Royal Flying Doctors Service, and various charities that focused on disability, medicine and orphans. The Golf Hill bequest set up under her will, which is here at Prov, the will, not the bequest, still exists today, and it supports similar causes. After Janet's death, very quickly after her death, the idea took hold that her philanthropy had all been carried out anonymously. One obituary suggested that, and it's then repeated in her entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and several historical studies of Australian female philanthropists then make the same claim, and it's repeated in blogs and on websites and so on. Inferences have been drawn from this supposedly anonymous giving, particularly the inference that it somehow speaks to the purity of Janet's altruism and that this in turn was gendered. In fact, digitised newspaper collections like Trove have allowed me to trace many, many, many public references to Janet's generosity and also to the numerous marks of esteem that she received because of it through her lifetime, really right across the first half of the 20th century. But I think it's also interesting, and this is how I'm going to finish my talk, by looking at how Janet used her philanthropy to shape Victoria's society and indeed Victorians' understanding of their history. The Biddlecombes' most significant joint donation was to Geelong Grammar School, a private Anglican school begun in 1855. The school was established to give pastoralist sons the same advantages and status as their English counterparts who'd been educated at Eton or Winchester. Relocated to Corio from central Geelong in 1914, Geelong Grammar went co-educational in 1976, and it remains one of Victoria's best known and most expensive private schools. Although, as I said, the Biddlecombes had no children, several of Janet's nephews were educated there, and in 1919, Janet and John gave Geelong Grammar £3,600 to build 2 houses for masters. By 1925, their further donations had paid for a total of 6 handsome detached houses. They're still there today and they're still handsome. And in 1938, so after John had died, Janet, along with 2 nephews and a niece, gave the school over £10,000 to build a music school in memory of her sister, their mother. The school named the road along which the masters' houses lay, Biddlecombe Avenue, and it installed a memorial tablet to John in its chapel in 1930, just after he died. Underscoring the foundational significance of the Biddlecombes' philanthropy to Geelong Grammar, in 2002, the school commemorated the couple via its Biddlecombe Society. Now, this is a society that honours and recognises those who declare their intention to favour Geelong Grammar in their wills, and I think it's quite interesting that the school emphasises Janet's philanthropic self-effacement, remembering her anonymous giving and so on, while publicly feting today future donors. The school's website also prioritises Commander John Biddlecombe over his wife, Janet. The Biddlecombes' gifts to Geelong Grammar fostered an institution dedicated to the replication of a colonising society. like Victoria's other colonial era private schools, churches, cultural collections, and indeed my own employer, the University of Melbourne, the school aimed to make colonisers feel both at home and part of a wider British civilisational project. And we see this desire at work again in my final example of Janet's philanthropy, how she explicitly used her wealth to shape the writing of Victoria's history and how we understand it. Now, one reason we know a lot about George Russell, her father, and the Clyde Company is because in the 1930s, Janet commissioned the publication of 7 volumes of documents about the Clyde Company and a book of her father's recollections. That's my version of them. Now, these books, published by Oxford University Press, in turn became foundational sources for historians writing about early colonial Victoria and its pastoral industries. Meticulously edited, they still are, immensely useful resources for historians. But their framing of Victoria's colonial era prioritised and romanticised the role of the pastoral industries, the Russell family and Scottish Presbyterians. So their role in Victoria's colonisation is really played up in these volumes. But at the same time, they underplayed, unsurprisingly, the violence, the expropriation and the links to slavery that I outlined earlier. Now, this huge literary undertaking wasn't completed at the time that Janet died, and her will left substantial financial provision for it to be completed. Janet also decided in her will that the original papers should go to the State Library of Victoria, and various artworks, books and furniture from Golf Hill at that point also entered the state's collections. All of these actions, I think, enshrined a version of Victoria's colonial history and cemented George Russell's legacy. Now, these philanthropic acts don't make Janet Biddlecombe either a hero or a villain. She was a product of colonial structures and mindsets. But I think we, historians and the public, should be more clear-eyed about where Janet's wealth came from and how she used it. Janet's philanthropy distributed a fortune that she had managed and significantly augmented, but that fortune was rooted in her inheritance from her father, George Russell. And Russell, in turn, multiplied the profits of Atlantic slavery on Indigenous land that he violently claimed as his own. I've outlined how gendered and often sexist assumptions shaped how Janet was understood by her contemporaries and how she's been remembered, whether we're thinking of her in her role as pastoralist and cattle breeder or as a very generous philanthropist. But Janet also successfully shaped her own and particularly her family's legacy, curating a particular version of Victoria's colonial past and doing so with wealth created through that colonialism itself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, it's just the next slide. Yeah, it'll just be the next slide.
Yep. Oh, we've gone backwards.
Oh. Excellent. Thank you. On the 22nd of January 1856, 220 men gathered at the Hall of Castlemaine in Castlemaine to vote in Victoria's first municipal elections. It was the height of the gold rush. Among them were 2 women. The council minutes recorded this with characteristic economy. Quote, 2 women tendered their votes, but the assessors ruled they had no right to vote. The next day, the Argus gave a little more detail. It named one of them. 2 women voted, it said. One, the famous Mrs. Fanny Finch, gave a plumper for Walter Smith. 2 women voted. One, the famous Mrs. Fanny Finch. What do you picture? Perhaps crinoline skirts, tightly laced corsets, high collars, shawls, perhaps composed, restrained expressions, but almost certainly white women. Australian history has trained us to imagine these women instantly, effortlessly, But that image rests on something deeper: generations of archival omission, dismissal, and indifference, culminating in a multitude of quiet, accidental acts of erasure. So let's replace that image with the truth. Black hair, black skin, and perhaps in her bright blue silk dress adorned with flowers. That is Mrs. Fanny Finch. Today I'm not going to focus on her time on the goldfields or her political actions, Instead, I want to share something more intimate with you. This is the story of a young black woman or girl who arrived from England on Kaurna country in South Australia in 1837. A woman at the threshold of becoming what we might call an African Australian woman. It's also a story about the archive, its silences, its distortions, and what it takes to read against them. I first encountered Fanny through a conversation with author Robin Annear and then from historian Marjorie Theobald, who described her as, quote, Castlemaine's first businesswoman. I began researching Fanny for my honours thesis on early feminist thought in Castlemaine, but before long, I just let her take over. I expected the search to be difficult. Women of this period often are. I assumed I'd have to reconstruct her life at times through the men around her or through theories of Goldfield society. After all, biographies of white men from this period are abundant. Women like Fanny, especially women of colour, simply don't appear. I assumed it was the archive itself that was lacking, but that assumption was wrong. That was my own unconscious historical memory at work. Erasure again kicked in. To understand Fanny Finch, or at least one version of her life, you have to follow a path through the archives, through memory, and through the gaps in between. You have to listen to her descendants, mostly women, many of whom didn't know she existed. In fact, in the 1970s, one of those descendants sensed something was missing in her family story and so began searching, but soon after was urged by a relative to stop asking questions. She made sense of the woman in her family collection, Fanny Finch, who owned property at the age of 24 in 1839, as a historical error. The dates didn't match up. It must be a mistake. Let alone did she know this property-owning woman was black. You also have to make space for a figure who doesn't fit neatly into our historical categories of colonial woman, a woman who was both shaped by empire and, in certain ways, an agent for it, a figure marginalised yet privileged in the context of Aboriginal dispossession, the settler colonial woman of colour. Erasure is multidimensional, it's gaslighting. Fanny Finch was born in April 1815 and baptised as Louisa King, the daughter of a domestic servant and a footman who disappeared before her birth. At 5 weeks old, her mother placed her in the London Foundling Hospital. For many children, this was a place of loss, but it was also one of opportunity. Fanny's belly was full. She was literate, indoctrinated into the Church of England, and trained for domestic service. By design, she was highly employable. But the records suggest that there's something unusual at play. In 1830, when she left to begin her apprenticeship, things began to unravel. She moved repeatedly between employers. Reports describe her as obstinate, dirty, resistant to instruction. Positions fell apart quickly, and Fanny fell into what could be read as a depression. Eventually, the hospital placed her on a weekly allowance, effectively pausing her apprenticeship. However, despite now being a paid worker, things did not change. Soon after, an employer described her as strange and even insane. The Foundling Hospital matron, however, painted a different picture. This was a young woman who looked wretched, thin, and deeply unhappy. Something was happening, but the records don't say what. And that silence matters. Much to the shock and horror of the Foundling Hospital, the matron went out on a limb and, after careful assessment of a prospective employer, placed Fanny in a boarding house. The hospital reluctantly agreed that not much more could be done for this young girl, so they conceded. However, things remained precarious. After another collapse in employment and a hospital stay, a doctor pleaded on Fanny's behalf, saying she had neither friends, money, nor a home to go to. The hospital paid her bill but refused to help further. From that point, she was alone. She leaves for South Australia the following year. At first glance, nothing in these records marks her as different. 19th century British archives were largely colourblind. They rarely recorded race explicitly. So a reader might assume Fanny was white, but her treatment stands out. The instability, the institutional reluctance, the pattern of breakdown and resistance. And so we're left with the question, what aren't we being told? In 1837, Fanny, still Frances Coombe, left England for South Australia as a domestic servant to Julia Wyatt. And with that journey, literally on the high seas, the archive shifts. On the voyage, aboard the John Renwick, among so-called, quote, superior immigrants, a young woman named Teresa Chauncey, a beneficiary of the slave compensation scheme, documented her fellow, quote, superior passengers in a satirical performance. When she came to Julia, Fanny suddenly became visible through her racial difference. Julia is described as a butterfly lightly skimming over the deck, and beside her is a stranger in colour so dingy. Before naming her by name, followed by a racial slur common to theatre at the time, Fanny is the only person named in the poem and the only one racialised. And just like that, the archive names what had previously been concealed. Welcome to Australia, Fanny. There is one final piece I want to share, and it doesn't come from an institution, but from art in a private collection. In 2014, at an arts fair in Birmingham, a woman came across a small embroidery, a sampler. Oh, that's the Foundling Hospital. It depicted a black couple standing before a large house. On the back were the words, Frances Coombe, a foundling, 1830. Fanny never knew her parents, but here in the thread, she may have imagined a different life, one of stability, belonging, perhaps even love. This piece doesn't fit neatly into the hospital's curriculum, and so perhaps it was a personal expression. This is a rare artefact that captures a moment when Fanny speaks without mediation. When the collector contacted the Foundling Hospital about her incredible find, she was dismissed. When she found out she was among Australia's first female voters, she contacted them again, but again heard nothing. Even now, the pattern continues. To find a place for Fanny Finch and other women like her, we're required to read the archive a little differently, to do away with empiricism and accept that while racial intersectional experience of colonial women was undocumented, it was real. We're required to spend a little more time in the parts of the archives that make us go, and reinscribe what has been systematically erased, not only from our secondary source material, but also from our own logic and better judgment. Thank you.